Hello and welcome. It seems like a perfect match, a consumer desperately in need of goods and a supplier with plenty of them. Except in the case of China and Africa, the marriage of business interests is raising a lot of questions. Between 1998 and 2006, Africa's exports to China increased by 2,126%. Fueled by the highest sustained growth rates in modern history, China's economy is increasingly dependent on Africa's resources. Well, critics see many dangers looming. For example, complaints that China is dumping low-priced goods in Africa, pillaging the continent's natural resources, and ignoring human rights violations and other humanitarian concerns. Supporters, however, point out that due to China, the overall economy of sub-Saharan Africa has grown by an average of 6% a year since 2004. Well, today we examine this potentially fragile relationship as we ask, is China exploiting African nations and reflecting colonialism, or is it offering them real economic growth and opportunity? Don't forget, we take your calls on this show and you can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Joining me from New York is award-winning investigative journalist Richard Bihar. As well as writing for top publications such as Fortune and Time magazine, he coordinates Project Klebnikov, a global media alliance investigating the murder of journalist Paul Klebnikov. Richard's extensive analysis, China Storms Africa, appeared in June's issue of Fast Company magazine. From Brussels, I'm joined by Dr. John FLE, the former director of the International Programme for Africa at the University of Guelph. He's also author of Digital Bridges, Developing Countries in the Knowledge Economy. And here in Washington, D.C., I'm joined by David Shin, the former U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia, now a professor at George Washington University. Gentlemen, I welcome you all. And Richard Bihar, if I could start with you and ask your comprehensive investigative study of China's business activities in Africa. It paints a fairly damning picture. It sort of equates China's activities there to being, parasitic in Africa's life system. Now, in a brief roundup, take us through what sort of particular damage you think that parasitic relationship is doing.
Well, as I talk throughout the piece, I also talk about America and the West's role as having been parasitic as well, and it's sort of a yin and a yang what China is doing in Africa. There's some good, there's some bad. It's difficult to say how it will play out, but there's no question that there is a massive resource extraction taking place. And again, it could be Africa's last chance to join globalization, or it could be a replay of colonialism. I think it's too early to tell.
Now, is it effectively that China's outmaneuvering countries like America in that it's doing really what everyone else would do given the same kind of resources and buying power that China has?
No question. I think it's I think China is essentially copying an economic model that worked very well for the West, both in resource exploitation, taking advantage of countries that aren't strong enough to make good deals. We can shake a finger at China and say bad, but we do have to look in the mirror as well. That said, you've got a communist government that is certainly not in Africa to spread democracy.
Well, Dr. John FLE, let me ask you if it's true that Africa is being exploited by Chinese business interests, and certainly some of the points Richard has made are very valid. Why are Africans putting up with it?
Well, I think we have to look at this situation from a perspective of the rules that govern internationalism of countries. Here, whether China exploits Africa or not, I want to look at it more in terms of what stage has Africa set in order to interact with the rest of the world. And if we are hungry for development aid, does that mean that we should subcontract our human rights obligations to other countries? I want to look at the fundamental aspects, and moreover, to see what are the solutions or what mechanisms could we put there so that whether it is China or Vietnam or India or Mongolia, whichever country that comes to the African continent, there are set rules that you go by. That is how I want to look at it, because right now it's a bit, we do not have the full picture yet, because we see African governments, African leaders, they are the ones who are opening up Africa to China. It's not that China invaded Africa with arms. So we have allowed people to come into our homes. Well, and when you go to Rome, you do as the Romans do, they say.
Well, let's before I get Ambassador David Shin involved, let me just get a quick call from Liberia, because Samuel's joined us on the line from there. Samuel, what would you like to ask?
Okay, Riz, good evening, good afternoon.
Hi, good evening.
My question happens to be, which power has not used Africa or has not used developing nations to take resources? Why is there sort of a competitional attitude from the West toward China's involvement in Africa? When isn't the United States
Okay.
getting involved in internal affairs of African countries?
Samuel, let me get, actually, this is actually, you raise a very valid point. That's exactly what I'd like to touch on with Ambassador David Shin, who's joined us, so I'm glad you're with us as well. And actually, it's a point that Samuel makes. Why, why is it that Africa has had this across the board from not just China, but it's been, other countries acting in a colonial way as well?
No, his point is very valid. In fact, the United States buys more oil from Africa than China buys from Africa today. China buys more minerals, more hardwood timber, but in terms of oil, it's the United States that's the big buyer. I think it's fair to say that all of the major players in Africa today have essentially the same interests, that is resource extraction, political interests, selling their goods to the continent. There are different tactics that they will use that do differentiate them. China doesn't pay much attention to good governance, for example.
Now, I was going to say that China seems to have built this relationship on whatever grounds, as you're mentioning, but it seems the US has had largely, at least recently, a disastrous relationship with many key African countries. I mean, literally from Sudan to Somalia.
Well, Sudan's a mixed bag because the U.S. was involved in negotiating the North-South Peace Agreement, which was a major success. On the Darfur side, it has not been successful. I think that it's fair to say that the United States has, in a political sense, sort of backed away a bit from Africa in probably the last 15 years. In terms of the resources provided, the United States has actually increased over the last 7 years by a factor of 3 the amount of resources going in, U.S. government resources going into the continent.
Okay, well, we have a caller on the line from Paris. Juliana, what would you like to ask?
Yes, Mr. Khan, good evening.
Good evening.
What I really want to ask is, why is China being demonized? In any case, all the Occidental countries did exactly the same thing. The only thing that I find with China is that their interests are for good. They might go away, they might derail, it's normal. But I think at the end of the day, their focus is to invest in Africa. We have to draw the rules and the lines to show them what to do. But I don't think that any other European or Occidental country did anything different other than to exploit Africa. So China, I believe, should not be demonized at all.
Well, let me put this to Richard Abeja, because that's exactly some of the points that have been made by the previous caller as well. And I guess we should point out that some African countries, such as Angola, have said no to China, in effect, haven't they?
Yes, they have. And I need to clarify that no one's demonizing the Chinese here, and I point that out in my piece. I didn't write a story about another yellow peril, but you really must keep in mind that China is at a different level here. At this point in China's development, economic development, it has a corrupt business culture. That cannot be denied. They are the world's #1 counterfeiter of products. They are stealing brands, intellectual property. That is where their economy is. Africa is the #1 transit point for those goods. China is the #1 jailer of journalists in the world. I think if I was working there, given the kind of investigating I do, I'd probably be in jail. The non-transparency that exists within China and within the government is being mixed in the sub-Sahara, where there's a lot of lack of transparency, and it's a very volatile combination. Look, this could wind up being the best thing that happened to Africa. It could wind up being the worst thing that's happened to Africa.
Yeah. Let me get Dr. John FLE here, and a question that came from my Facebook website, and I'm glad we have viewers sending us questions through the Facebook website. Viewer Ishard made this point. He says, China's interest in Africa must be treated with distrust. Too often, the discourse around solving Africa's problems have been decorated with warm terms like economic growth and skills development, and have cloaked the reality behind this interest. For Africa to flourish, it must help itself. It must find African solutions to African problems. This is partly what Juliana in Paris touched on. So, Dr. FLE, to what extent can Africa manage its own affairs without that kind of input of China or other countries?
I think Africa has a core constituency to look at in terms of Africans themselves. And we are talking about the Africans abroad. These are the people who have been to the schools that everybody else has been to, that is in a Western country. And these people are residing outside. They have the expertise and sometimes the resources, or at least this will be a group that can be a filter between China and Africa, because we know where China wants to go. I mean, Chinese economy wants to go, because I live in the US. I am a Canadian as well. And China wants to get to that level of development. But I have experienced this firsthand. I'm not alone in this. There are so many millions of Africans abroad that have the expertise and in the skills that Africa is looking for. So how does China work with these people in order that they transfer these skills to Africa?
We have a question that came in also from Facebook, Ambassador Shin, which I'd like to put to you in, and it came from Talal Tabit, who says, how do China's actions in Africa affect their trade relationship with the United States? He goes on to say, what is the long-term plan for China in Africa? Is it just a resource drain? In the first instance, I mean, looking at the first part of the question, Talal's asking, you know, effectively the relationship America's having with African nations, and how is that affected by the fact that those countries have ties to China, closer ties to China?
I don't think that the relationship is very significant. Only 3% of China's trade is with Africa. That's all total imports and exports. Only 1% of American trade, global trade, is with Africa. So the interaction in terms of the United States, I think, is not really particularly great. There, at some point in time, may be some competition for oil, but that is the only resource I see where there's likely competition.
Now, can America compete with China, considering the foreign exchange reserves? I mean, China has something like 1.65 trillion compared with 62 billion in terms of foreign exchange reserves.
The United States can compete with things like Boeing aircraft. It cannot compete with the vast majority of the other products that are being sold in Africa today, because the price of the U.S. products is just too high. Even companies like Motorola, that used to sell a lot of communications equipment, are now being undersold by Huawei or ZTE.
Well, gentlemen, I'm going to say just stand by for a moment as we take a very short break. We'll be back with more on this look at China's push for African resources in just a moment.